Hello, everyone. I'm Amy VanScoy. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Information Science at the University at Buffalo, in Buffalo, New York, in the United States. And I am so honored to be here today to get to talk to you about my research and join in your great conference. I did get to look over the presentations. I had to read them translated into English, as my Slovene is not very strong. But I have enjoyed everything that you all have had to say, and I hope you felt like it was as stimulating a conference as it seems to be from my end. Now, before I begin, I want to acknowledge the support of the Slovenian Library Association. I wouldn't be here today if not for their invitation to come and speak, but also I appreciate that the Library Association gave me some assistance when I was trying to get ethical clearance to do my research in Slovenia. So that took some effort on the part of your organization, and I sincerely appreciate it. So, I'm happy to be talking to you today. I wish I were in Slovenia right now. I wish that I had gotten to visit the neck of the chicken, which I still have not visited, but maybe at a future conference. So I'm glad to be with you all here today. So let me tell you about myself first. As I mentioned, I'm now a faculty member and I teach primarily information behavior and reference and information service and diversity, equity, and inclusion courses at the University at Buffalo. Prior to that, I was a librarian. I worked at North Carolina State University Libraries, which is down in the south of the United States. And I did reference and instruction and management at that library. So that gives you some idea of why I'm talking so much today about librarians and why I'm talking so much about reference and information service. I hope that none of you feel excluded, those of you that don't work in public services. I think that the things that I'm going to say are just as applicable to all the other environments in which you work, but unfortunately most of my examples come from my own practice and my own research. I want to let you know that you are welcome to contact me after the presentation. You can go to my website to find out more about me and the research that I've done. All of the studies that I'm talking about are at least referenced on my webpage, and my email address is there. So if you ever want copies of any of the papers that I've talked about, I'd be more than happy to email them to you. So just email me and let me know you're interested. Let's see, so we'll go ahead and get started. What I really wanted to do was talk to you today about my research journey. I hope it will be just interesting to you all, but it also might be motivating. There might be some ideas here that you can incorporate into your own practice, or might be useful when you're talking to colleagues or to pre-service librarians that you're mentoring. So I hope there's a little something in here for everyone. Now, I don't have to tell you that librarians work in an incredibly dynamic context of change. I mean, that's what you've been talking about today, the users in the context of change. Well, there's librarians in the context of change as well. There's definitely a lot of uncertainty, which is, I think, very similar to change. And years ago, as I was first studying the reference interaction, I attempted to map out the areas of uncertainty just in the moment of the reference interaction. As you can see here, this map, which is pretty complicated, I just tried to map out as time was going along. That's kind of in the middle there. And there's all this other uncertainty. So user characteristics, the characteristics of the librarian and the characteristics of the organization. So for example, how well funded it is, what kind of rules they have, and all that sort of thing. So just a way of trying to identify areas where uncertainty may occur in the reference interaction. So the point is there are all sorts of sources of uncertainty just there in the reference interaction, and I'm sure that all of you who don't work in reference, your minds are flitting to all those sources of uncertainty that happen in your daily work, the things that you can't be fully prepared for, can't anticipate, and that introduce additional change into your context. So before we leave the idea of uncertainty, I want to talk about another study that I did. This was a study of the lived experience of reference and information service for librarians who work in academic research libraries. So these would be highly research intensive higher education organizations. And this was a interpretive phenomenological analysis study, or IPA. This is a method that has a highly structured procedures for analyzing, interpreting people's lived experience. So one of the themes that emerged from that study, there were 5 themes, and one of them was variety and uncertainty. On the screen, you can see one of the participant quotes that supported this theme. When you work at a reference desk, it's like anyone can ask you any conceivable question at any time. Other people said, you never know what you're going to get or where it goes. Another participant said, you really truly never know what's going to come at you. And someone else said, you're not in control of what's going on. So overall, the sense of variety was positive. This uncertainty kind of, the participants interpreted it as variety, and it was interesting for their jobs. But as you can hear in the quotes, it takes a certain amount of energy, of being able to deal with sort of this constant uncertainty. So when you think here about librarians' work and how uncertain it is, just in the nature of the work itself, and then you add in all of the other things that change over time. So technology changes, socio-political changes, changes in value, environmental changes. It's just an incredibly dynamic environment of change in which you all are trying to do that work. And you're completely familiar with this, and I don't have to tell you this is going on. But what I think is really important is that we acknowledge that. So often librarians are asked to do more with less, to work as the sole professional in a small library without a whole lot of colleagues around them and a whole lot of support. And I just think that it's important to acknowledge this environment of change, this ever-changing dynamic situation that requires a high cognitive load, that requires lots of retooling and nimbleness as a profession. And I think sometimes if we can acknowledge these things, then then we can move forward in changing them or adapting to them or getting the skills we need to move forward. So what you all have been focusing on so far in this conference is the user in the context of change, and what I want to shift our focus to is the librarian in the context of change. I think this is really worth doing, partly because I think the work that you do is valuable, but when you think about just the reference interaction, and once again, I'm turning to reference as an example, but I think this applies in other areas of librarianship as well. When you think about the elements of the reference interaction, there's the user, there's the information resources, and then there's the librarian. And this model comes from, this is not one I created, this comes from Denise Augusto and her colleagues. And they did a study on what were the elements of the modern reference interaction that were important. But you can see how these are sort of the 3 elements. And I think in all areas of libraries, we see the user and the librarian or the information professional is there somewhere, even if they're in the background, setting up the database, setting up the systems, organizing the books and getting them on the shelves, things like that. So the librarian is always there in the decision-making capacity, at least. Now, when you think about these 3 elements of the model, it's the librarian that we have the most control over. We don't really have a lot of control over users. We can put up signage and we can provide user instruction and try to have interfaces that are really user-friendly. And we can have some control over the information resources. We can, purchase ones that we think are going to be useful. We can choose technology we think is going to be helpful. But really that librarian is the thing that we have 100% control over all the time. Well, most control over all the time. So that's where my research focuses. And I just want to pause for a minute. If we were in person together, I would stop and I would ask if anyone had any questions and try to answer a few. So let me pause. I'll remind you of my website address at this point in case you want to revisit it in the future, and also the studies that I've referred to so far in case you want to jot those down. So as I said, I want to share the research that I've done, primarily, well, to maybe generate some interest in it, but primarily I want to share it out with you because I think it can help librarians to reflect on their practice. You can think about whether this research seems to describe your experience or not. And I think it's helpful also for us to articulate what we do to administration and to the public, and maybe it would help also share some understanding between colleagues as well. So my research journey began when I was a librarian, and I worked with a fantastic team of librarians who were all really committed to what they were doing, really engaged with their practice, very bright. It was an excellent environment to work in. But in this environment, I noticed that in some decision-making situations, people would disagree, come from completely different perspectives, and they would disagree. And it was a little bit of a challenge for me to reconcile how people could think really different from each other and yet all be such engaged and committed librarians, all with the focusing on the user and all with the right kind of what I saw as good values and really trying to do a good job. So my thinking was, how can I articulate these different ways of thinking so that we can see each other, understand each other a little bit better, but also value the different perspectives that we bring to our practice. And I think that maybe you could call this orientations. That's the sort of phrase for this they use in social work. I've also heard the phrase professional ideologies, which is as opposed to what you should be doing. A professional ideology is sort of how you should be doing it, or what are the values behind what you do. So those may be terms that would help describe the area where I'm interested in doing my work. So let me tell you about a study I did recently, and this is a Q methodology study with 66 participants, and some of them were in Slovenia too. So I'm really excited to be sharing this research with you. A Q methodology study is a method that tries to make sense of many differing opinions on a topic. And it uses a card sort. And I've got an image here of one of the cards. For example, there's statements about reference and information service that were made by actual librarians in previous studies that I did before. And the participants sort these cards according to which are most like the way they think and which are least like the way they think. So you end up with a quasi-normal distribution, like a bell curve looking shape of these cards, and they can only put one in the most like the way they think column and one in the least like the way they think column. And you can see in this image, a person is trying to sort the cards in that shape. Now the card sorts then, once a person sorts all the cards, those card sorts are analyzed with a special software that's designed for Q methodology, and what you end up with are these sort of archetypes of sorts, so kind of like an average sort, and I'll show you what those were for my study in a minute. After the card sorting, then also there's a short interview where the researcher asks, why the cards were sorted in a particular way, and that helps to helps the researcher to understand what the participants thought about a particular card, like how they interpreted that statement. In this particular study, with these 66 participants, there were three factors that a three-factor solution was found, and I'm going to tell you about those three factors now. So the first one is transformation and empathy. And the librarians who viewed reference and information service as a transformative activity for the user and focused on affective dimensions of the user's experience. They are passionate about facilitating change and conscious of the emotionally vulnerable position that users are in. The second factor, or archetype kind of reference and information service, is communication and information provision. Now, these librarians view reference and information service as a communication between librarian and user for the purposes of providing information. They value development of a rapport and efficiently providing the information that the user needs. And the third group is called empowering and learning. These librarians view reference and information service as a learning activity that could empower users to be independent information seekers. These librarians value instruction for the purpose of helping users to be self-sufficient. Now, some of these factors may seem really obvious to you. You might say, yes, of course, reference and information service is about providing information. Of course, it has to do with communication. Of course, it has to do with instruction. But what was helpful with this study was it took all of these multiple things that people have talked about in the literature and brought them together into three categories that many people fit into. Now, there's a few people who don't fit into any of these categories, and I'll show you some data about that in a minute. But in general, this tells us a few things. So it tells us that the instruction that people talk about in the literature is not just about teaching, but it's really about empowering user learning. I think that's an important nuance of focus. For those of you that have a teaching background, you might agree with me that that's an important nuance. It also shows, for example, people talk about the reference interaction as a communication activity. Some say it's an information provision activity. Well, for librarians who value communication and information provision, both of those are important together. It's not like a one or the other situation for the librarians I interviewed. And then I think that first category, transformation and empathy, people haven't really talked about that much in the literature. There's a little bit of discussion about understanding users and where they're coming from, but not nearly as much as the importance that came out in this study. And it may be that in the last few years, there have been a lot of things that have happened socially and globally that make us think a little bit more about what other people are going through. So maybe that's more on librarians' minds than it had been in the past. But still, those three categories seem to describe most people. Now, I'll show you, just in case you're interested, the distributions of the different factors over the three countries where I studied. So I did this study. I told you I had some participants in Slovenia. I also had some in South Africa and the United States. And part of what I was hoping to explore was whether there was a difference in the distribution, or how people viewed reference by country. And I wouldn't say this study was designed to prove that, but I just thought I'd share with you this table so you can see that in all countries, all of those orientations were present. And you can also maybe take a look at the ones in Slovenia to get a sense of what your fellow citizens said. And I also thought I would break down the data from the Slovenian participants, just so that you could see where your colleagues, which categories they were in. And this is a distribution of participants by their orientation, but also by the type of library they worked in. One of the exploratory questions was whether orientation would depend on type of library. Some people think that in higher education libraries that the librarians are always instructing. Other people say in public libraries it's just about giving information. And I wanted to explore that, and I think that the data says that that might be true, but it might also not be true. So I will caution with this table that I'm showing you here, there were so few participants, and the method is not designed to be generalizable to the larger population. So you should not interpret this data as, this would be, this is what the distribution of these orientations would be like if you did a study of everyone in Slovenia. But it's just interesting to see where there are, that people fall into these categories in various types of libraries. I'll point out too, while you're looking at the slide, that that bottom row is not a total. It's people who didn't fall into a single factor. And I think that's kind of interesting too, just to point out that not everyone loads completely on one factor, and some people sort of agreed with everything. So the real takeaway for this study is that librarians have different ways of approaching reference and information service that don't necessarily have to do with what they do, but what they think is important about what they do, or their values. And it's important because it depends on the librarian, not necessarily the country where they live or the type of library that they work in. So it's really up to you to be reflecting about your practice and choosing how it is you're going to go forward. So what is the professional ideology that you're going to follow? And that's really hard in this fast-paced context of change that we're talking about, to take the time to reflect about things like, what's your orientation to practice, and what's your idea of really good reference service? Because there's always, some crisis to deal with, someone who needs your support and needs your help, or needs a decision made. So I think that these orientations might help. They might be a tool for librarians who do reference and information service to think about these categories kind of already created, and think about what they mean and which ones resonate with you, or do all of them resonate with you. It can also be an activity that could spark some conversation between colleagues. So which ones do you value? Which ones do your colleagues value? And how does that make you a stronger team, because you come at your reference and information service from different standpoints? Some of the librarians in the study did say that they appreciated the chance to think about the work that they do. So I'll read a quote for you. One of them said, "We don't really talk on this kind of theoretical level at all, essentially, in my library. So to know that there are other librarians out there who is thinking along the same directions that I am was really nice." Another sort of similar quote I'll read. "It shows us like another side, like I never thought about that. And so we learn from each other, even if we're on the other side." So I kind of like this this idea that such an activity might help librarians to value each other's differences as well as the things that they have in common. So I'm going to stop again for a minute. I'm going to pause, give you a chance to ask questions in the chat if you would like to do that, and I'll try and answer them. Also I'll give you the citation to the work that I've been talking about in case you want to jot that down. But of course you don't have to remember everything about it. Just email me and ask me, and I will be happy to share a paper with you. So I was talking earlier about the study that I did about the lived experience of reference and information service with librarians who work in these huge research libraries. Now, when I did that study, the group of librarians was pretty homogenous from a demographic perspective. So they came mostly from the majority demographic in librarianship in the United States, which is white. There are a very small number in the United States of librarians of color. And librarians of color is a group, that very diverse group, that defines itself together, but can be very diverse in their racial ethnic makeup. And the reason that I bring this up is because when we do research in librarianship, because there are so many white librarians, we tend to hear their voices really strongly. So if we do a survey, for example, if 90% of the librarians come from the same racial ethnic background, then that's the results that get reported. Most of the librarians thought X, or most of the librarians had this perspective. So it is really important to me to seek out these minority voices, to seek out the voices in the profession that aren't heard as often, partly to be ethical, but also because they may have information to share with the rest of the profession as well. Now, I know nothing about the racial ethnic makeup of Slovenia. I know nothing about what you might consider a minoritized group in your country. It may not be a racial ethnic group as it is in the United States, so it may be a language or a religion. But I do think it's important when studying librarians to include deliberately librarians from underrepresented minoritized groups. So let me explain why I think that's important. So in that original study that I was telling you about, that was done mostly with white librarians, the kinds of activities in reference that people talked about were teaching, doing instruction, providing information, developing relationships. Those were kind of the three big things that they talked about as part of their job. And when I did the same study with a group of 8 librarians from underrepresented groups. So again, this was an interpretive phenomenological analysis study, exactly the same kind of study, just with a different population. We had men and women from all different kinds of libraries. And the interesting thing that I got out of that study was the focus on what I called user development. It was this idea that the librarians were there to sort of share their social capital, their academic capital, their social capital with users of color that came into their library. And I'll read you a quote from one of those librarians. She said, "When I have the opportunity to interact with the students, I let them know, I am you, and if I can get to this level, you most certainly can." And so what they were doing was being a role model and addressing broader needs than just the question that they came into the library with, but also things like how to make them a successful student, how to help them get the information they needed for their family, and just realizing that they had a lot to share beyond just that interaction. So my thinking is, if I hadn't done this research, if I hadn't reached out to this smaller group, I never would have learned that librarians have this as an important activity of their job. So I encourage you, when you're doing research, those of you that do research, or when you're looking for ideas and trying to surround yourself with people with, surround yourself to make a decision or discuss an issue, that surrounding yourself with people who think differently than you and have different background than you really can help to bring a source of innovative ideas, and at the very least, make sure everybody feels heard. So I just wanted to share that bit of research because to me that was more important than the study itself, was that realizing how valuable it was to reach out and listen to librarians that don't usually contribute to this kind of research. So let's see, we've talked so far about the librarian in this context of dynamic, ever-changing service. And I wanted to talk specifically about how librarians have talked about change in particular. So earlier I showed you an image that had a statement, a card that said librarian as agent of change. So when I did the Q methodology study, and these people sorted those cards, one of the cards said librarian as agent of change. And this, I didn't know how people would interpret this statement. This was a statement that an actual librarian had made, and so I put it word for word on that card, but I wasn't really sure how participants would interpret that and what they would do with that idea. But interestingly, many people place that card in the most important, most like the way I think position. So that made me wonder, there were 20 people who did this, and 20 out of 66 is a lot of people to put that card really high in their card sort. So I took the interview data that surrounded that card. I did a qualitative secondary analysis of that data and specifically looked at how librarians interpreted that card and whether they placed it really high or placed it really low. There were 6 that placed it very, very low. So I wanted to look at those 2 sets of people. So librarians talked about the responsibility they had to provide change, as well as the position of privilege that they were in that they had the education and the position and the perspective to be able to encourage the change. But then they also talked about different contexts for change. And that's what's here on this slide, were the sort of areas, realm of change that the participants talked about. So the first one is individual change. So some librarians felt that they were changing, making small changes for individual users. One librarian said, you're giving them the power to change not their thoughts, but the way they interact with the world. A Slovenian public librarian said, you can influence them maybe for just a short time. You can change some thoughts. Now, another group of participants saw their change as being more at the organizational level. They were able to affect how teachers saw the library, for example, the teachers in their school, or they contributed to the organization, say, in their IT decision-making. One Slovenian librarian who worked in higher education said she felt like it was her mission to bring change to the institution. She said, it's very important to be the wind of change. And then the final context where librarians may influence change is on a societal level, just making change in the community or in society. One librarian said, as someone in a position of privilege with an education from the background I have, that is my job, to be someone who lifts other people up and effectuates positive change in our society. So what I think is most interesting about this study is that librarians who felt that they were agents of change saw that in different ways. So again, not all librarians take things from the exact same perspective. So that says that should you want to be an agent of change, or should you think about your practice and this is something that you value, you can do it in many ways. You don't have to go out and change the world or the community, but maybe you want to change things one user at a time. And this also may help for you to understand your colleagues who see things really differently. When there's arguments about values, maybe it comes down to different levels of comfort with how that change occurs. And so perhaps this is a tool to be able to have some discussions about where you and your colleagues want change to occur, how everyone can contribute. So before I finish up, I just want to share a quick preview for one other study that I'm working on. Maybe you will just watch out for it. It has Slovenian participants, so that's why I thought you might be interested. So I'm working on this study with Barbara Kaučić from the Ministry of Culture, if you don't know her. And we were interested in the lived experience of reference and information service for special librarians. So we have some participants from Slovenia and some participants from the United States as well. And we picked special libraries because there's so much change happening there and so much diversity, and yet there is almost no research on this group. So we really thought it was time to dive in. And again, we're doing a small qualitative study to really understand what reference and information service is for these librarians. So as I said, a small study with interpretive phenomenological analysis, but that is ongoing. So you'll have to watch the webpage and find out more about it. So let me finish up with some final thoughts. I hope that as I've been talking, one thing you've thought about is all the different perspectives that librarians can bring to their work. I mean, I've talked a lot about reference and information service in particular, but it goes for all areas of librarianship as well. There's many different perspectives, and it's important to give yourself a chance to think about them, to think about what perspectives your colleagues have and be able to articulate those. And I hope you also are thinking about how much of a difference your work makes, the deliberate intention that you go into your work with ends up making a difference, in my opinion. But I want you to have a few concrete takeaways. With all this time spent listening to me, I want to make sure that you're going away with something useful. So here's my concrete takeaways from today's talk. So I think that it's important to acknowledge the dynamic, ever-changing context that you work in. That is underappreciated by people who don't work in libraries. Sometimes people say they want to work in the relaxing environment of a library, and I'm always shaking my head thinking, no, you don't know what you're getting into. These are fast-paced and environments that are always dealing with change. I hope you'll also think about reflecting on your professional ideology or your orientation to practice. Maybe you see yourself in one of the three factors I mentioned: the transformation and empathy, communication and information provision, or empowerment and learning. Or maybe you see yourself in one of the areas of change, an individual level change, or organizational level, or social level. And maybe you'll take some time to consider these other orientations that don't resonate with you. So maybe they would help you to grow or deal with new users or new problems, or something you might want to try out and explore. Or they might help you to understand your colleagues when conflicts occur, like the story I talked about at the very beginning of the talk with my colleagues that seemed to be talking at cross purposes when in fact they had the same goal. If they could have used some of these frameworks to talk about their differences, I think they could have appreciated each other's approach a little more. I also suggest listening to the minority voice, because sometimes there are wonderful gems that you get when you listen to voices that are quiet. And finally, maybe there's a way that you can see yourself being a source of positive change if you don't already think about yourself that way. So much of the change we have is out of our control, but you can make change in the ways that you value. So I'm going to pause here and show you one more slide with a couple of citations on it, since that's the way I've been communicating the citations. And also feel free to add questions in the chat. So once again, let me say thank you for having me talk. I feel like I've been talking for a really long time, but I hope that you found some of it entertaining, maybe a bit useful. And if you're interested in anything that I'm working on, please feel free to contact me. I'm always excited to talk about the work that I'm doing. I'm always excited to listen to librarians talk about the work that they're doing. And if there are things that you think need to be researched or something that you might like to collaborate with me on, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me, because I am hoping to do some more work in Slovenia. I'm hoping to come back and see some of you in person instead of just online. So again, Vala, thank you for having me, and I'll take any questions that you have.